Well, staying with climate, the COP29 summit is being held in Baku, Azerbaijan this week. And this year's event has been dubbed the Finance COP. Negotiators must increase a $100 billion a year target to help developing nations prepare for the worsening impacts of climate change and wean their economies off fossil fuels. How much is to be on offer and who will pay for it are the two major points of contention. To talk to us about that, Valerie Dekimpe, our environment editor, with me now. Valerie, first of all, we have this existing target then of $100 billion annually. I just mentioned that. If negotiations are successful, the new goal could reach $1 trillion. Why are we seeing such a big jump?
Well, the 100 billion target a year was never adequate in the first place. It was a promise made in 2009, but there was never any economic reasoning behind it. It was just an arbitrary number. Since then, economists have worked to assess what it would cost to face the climate crisis, and they came up with a number: $2.4 trillion every single year would be needed for developing countries, excluding China, to cut their greenhouse gas emissions and also adapt to the consequences of global warming. They say that of that sum, about half could come from countries' own domestic budgets and also domestic investments, and that would leave roughly $1 trillion coming from developed nations.
The UN climate chief, though, is insisting this isn't charity, this money. Why is the new goal so important?
It's obviously a climate justice question. Developing nations did not cause the climate crisis in the first place. Wealthy nations did. And so you can understand why developing nations today are saying, hang on, you've become rich with your fossil fuel powered economies. You're asking us to stop using what made you rich, but not helping in the process. So in order to address the climate crisis, you need everyone on board. And so you need to provide that financial aid. And just to give you an example, developing nations, the developed countries, they have access to capital markets. Developing nations, it's a lot more expensive. And so an example of that is that Africa has about 60% of the best solar resources in the world. And yet you have, some European countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, Poland, not necessarily known for their sunshine. They have installed more solar panels than the whole of sub-Saharan Africa in 2023. Why? Because it costs a lot more money to actually install solar panels in Africa because the cost of capital is higher.
And Valerie, look, this $1 trillion figure, can it actually be delivered? Where's the money from that likely to come from?
Well, it sounds huge, $1 trillion, but it's actually 1% of global GDP. It's also a year of pure profit for the fossil fuel industry. For the last 50 years, on average, they've made $1 trillion every single year. And so the money does exist. It's a question of it's a political question. So no developed country, as we stand, is ready to commit to a specific figure as long as we don't expand the donor base of who actually contributes. Other countries that are also quite wealthy and polluting. So, for example, the group of countries obliged to actually provide climate finance, that list was prepared in 1992. The world economy has changed massively since then. You have emerging economies like China, South Korea, a lot richer than they used to be. They pollute a lot more. They're still considered developing. Petrostates, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, also considered developing nations, although they have amassed vast oil wealth. So it's another kind of climate justice question. Should only historical high emitters contribute, or should we open up the donor base? China has been very clear that they don't want to give up on their developing status.
Just a final question then. If countries aren't going to pay, who will?
Economists say that much of the funding will not actually come from taxpayers' money in the West. It's actually multilateral development banks like the World Bank, the IMF. We are looking at about 200 to 400 billion a year in the form of low interest loans, but that will require sweeping reform, so it will take time. And there's the other idea of global taxes, solidarity taxes being increasingly currently discussed. So, for example, a 2% wealth tax on billionaires. This is a Brazilian proposal. They have shown that just with 100 billionaire families in Brazil alone, you could potentially raise more than $250 billion every single year. And then you obviously have taxes on polluting industries, shipping, aviation, financial transactions, and that could generate about $900 billion by 2030. But it will, again, require a specific global agreement. The most likely scenario at COP is that we will reach an estimate or at around, a couple of billions of public funding, the rest having to come from private investments. But if you think about the fact that developed countries were never able to achieve their promise of providing 100 billion only by 2020, you can understand that it's going to be a massive challenge to get to $1 trillion.
Indeed, but very important story. Thanks for breaking that down for us, Valerie Dekimpe, our environment editor, for us there.